All right. Well, hi everyone. I'm Carly Viña, and this is episode 307 of At Percussion. With me today, as usual, Ben Charles is here. Hey, Ben.
Hey Carly, how are you?
Good, good, good. You got a nice festive Happy Halloween orange shirt on?
Yeah, which happy Thanksgiving if you're listening to this.
It's a little funny. And Caleb Pickering's also here. Hey, Caleb.
Hey, how's it going?
Good. How's Missouri treating you?
It's good. Yeah, like you mentioned earlier, it's just it's cold. They get actual winter here, so I gotta do some wardrobe updates here in a couple of weeks.
Still, I see your wardrobe still doesn't include a diploma frame.
I'm still working. I'm still working on it. Yeah, moved in and everything's half in boxes, still half out.
Hey, I'm in the same boat. And if you think Missouri has real winter, for me, I'm like Virginia has real winter, and I got to update my wardrobe. So we're in the same boat, I suppose. Well, as I mentioned, today's Halloween, our recording date, and that's why Casey's out. He's probably trick-or-treating with Robin right now. And our release date is actually November 25th, which is Thanksgiving Day. So happy Thanksgiving if you happen to be listening to our podcast that day. What happened in music history on November 25th, Ben?
Well, another holiday thing, in 1949, Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer first appeared on the music charts. That was the most notable music item, but I decided to talk about another thing today, and that's that in 1835, Andrew Carnegie was born. Andrew Carnegie, of course, the famous Scottish-American industrialist and philanthropist. He made his fortune in the steel industry in the late 19th century. He was one of the wealthiest people in American history, and he was also a generous philanthropist. He gave away about 90% of his fortune during the last 18 years of his life, which was around $350 million or $5.2 billion. That's B, billion in today's money. His article titled The Gospel of Wealth, which was published in the North American Review, called for the rich to use their wealth to improve society. And the most notable example for us as musicians, of course, is Carnegie Hall, which is located at 881 7th Avenue in New York City between 56th and 57th Streets. It presents about 250 performances each season. So a brief history of Carnegie Hall. There was a conductor of the Oratorio Society of New York and the New York Symphony Society named Leopold Damrosch, and he had an idea for a music hall. He died in 1885. 2 years later, his son, Walter Damrosch, met Andrew Carnegie in Germany when he was studying music. And he approached Carnegie about this project. Carnegie was initially uninterested in funding a music hall in Manhattan, but he changed his mind and agreed to give $2 million to the project. William Tuthill was selected as the architect for the project. He was relatively unknown at the time, but he was an amateur cellist and singer, which possibly had something to do with him getting the commission. He designed the hall in a modified Italian Renaissance style. It's 3 structures in an L shape, each of which contains one of the hall's performance spaces, which we'll talk about in just a second. The recital hall opened in March 1891. The oratorio hall opened in April 1891, and the music hall opened in May 1891 with a concert conducted by Walter Damrosch, who was the person that had spoken with Andrew Carnegie about creating this hall, and Tchaikovsky, which I did not know. At the opening concert, the architect, William Tuthill, looked at the crowds on the top tiers and left to consult his drawings because he was unsure if the columns could actually support the weight of the crowd, which turned out to be okay. I guess it was fine. And Tchaikovsky said the auditorium was unusually impressive and grand when illuminated and filled with an audience. So the 3 performance spaces are Stern Auditorium, which is the large hall. It's a 5-story auditorium with 2,804 seats. It was originally known as the Main Auditorium. It was renamed after the violinist Isaac Stern in 1997 to recognize his efforts in saving the hall from demolition in the 1960s. It was the home of the New York Philharmonic from 1892 until 1962, when they famously left for the Lincoln Center, and the stage is known as the Ronald Perelman stage. The next hall is the Zankel Hall. which seats 599. It was originally known as the Recital Hall. It was renamed in gratitude to Judy and Arthur Zankel for funding a renovation of the venue. It went through several iterations, including a life as a cinema, which I found kind of interesting, but it has been a performance space since 1997. It was most recently completely reconstructed in 2003. And last but not least, Weil Hall, or Weil Recital Hall, which seats 268. It was originally called the Chamber Music Hall. It was renamed in 1987 after Sanford Weil, a former chairman of Carnegie Hall's board. And I thought I would talk very briefly about a few historical things for us percussionists. Oh, sorry, and I meant to show pictures as I was doing all that. Let me show you some pictures of those varying halls. So here is, in reverse order from what we just talked about, the Weil Recital Hall. Right there. And then, let's see here. Here's the Zankel Hall, the sort of mid-sized hall. And Stern Auditorium, the large hall. And then a few percussion-related events. On May 16th, 1935, Claire Omar Musser brought his 100-piece International Marimba Symphony Orchestra to Carnegie Hall. There's a picture of them in that hall. It was 50 women and 50 men with $100,000 worth of instruments, or about $1.5 million in today's money. And in 1940, let's see here, April 29th, 1940, the Creston Marimba Concertino premiered with an all-female orchestra called the Orchestre Classique, conducted by Frédéric Petrides, with Ruth Stuber as the soloist. That's them in the Carnegie Chamber Music Hall, which is now Weil Recital Hall. And let's see here, this one. Let's see here, April 7th, 1947 was the first marimba recital in Carnegie Hall by the Guatemalan marimbist Celso Hurtado, which included arrangements of Brahms, Paganini, and Liszt. Here's the program from that, if you're watching on YouTube. And my last little bit of marimba history here is that Vida Chenoweth premiered the Kirka Marimba Concerto, which, as far as I can read into, is the first quote-unquote invited performance of a marimba player at Carnegie Hall, whatever that means. I don't know if the others just showed up with the marimba and refused to leave or what, but Vida was the first invited marimba player. And I wanted to close on, there's a very famous joke, if you're outside of Carnegie Hall and someone says, "How do you get to Carnegie Hall?" The answer is practice, practice, practice. So that's Today in Music History. Thank you to Andrew Carnegie for his generous contribution to the arts.
Ben, that's so great. I love those old pictures.
Yeah.
Musser Marimba Orchestra, all of them. That's so cool. Thanks.
Yeah.
Well, without further ado, I am very happy to introduce today's guest, Dale Trumbore. Dale Trumbore is a Los Angeles-based composer and writer. Her music has been praised by the New York Times for its soaring melodies and beguiling harmonies. Her compositions have been performed widely in the U.S. and internationally by ensembles including the Aeolians, American Contemporary Music Ensemble, Los Angeles Master Chorale, Los Angeles Children's Chorus, and many, many more. As a writer, Dale is the author of Staying Composed, Overcoming Anxiety and Self-Doubt Within a Creative Life, and she's written extensively about working through creative blocks and establishing a career in music. These have been published in several different publications, and they're all also accessible on her website, so check that out if you haven't already. Dale holds a Master's of Music degree in composition from the University of Southern California, and also a dual degree in music composition and English from the University of Maryland, which is where I know her from. And in fact, Dale and I collaborated many, many years ago on the Mio Percussion Concerto, which I think is one of those pieces where the piano reduction is like much harder than the solo part. And she just did an amazing job and was so wonderful to work with. So welcome to the show, Dale. It's so great to see you.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me here. It's great to see you again.
Same to you. So I wanted to start talking about your book, Staying Composed. There's just so much wisdom in this book, all wrapped up. What a wonderful resource for performers and for composers, and I think really any kind of artists. Myself, I've found following your advice on several occasions since I started reading it. So I'm wondering if you tell us a little bit about how your path as a composer led you to many of these realizations about your creative work, and then also to decide to write them down in a book.
Yeah, so I grew up in a family of writers and double majored in English. I've always loved reading. So writing has always been something that's available to me, but I didn't really know that I wanted to be writing about my creative process until I went to a residency at Aaron Copland's house in what is it, Peekskill, New York, I think, upstate New York. And I was so intimidated being at this residency, thinking that Aaron Copland had lived there for the last 20 years of his life. I was listening to his music, and they had all of his, not his original scores, but his, copies of all of his music. Every piece is in the little library there. And I was just so overwhelmed in that particular experience. And then I ultimately found my way through to finishing the music I set out to write while I was there. I did get that music composed, but I had to work through sort of every possible anxiety about, imposter syndrome. Like, why am I here? Why did they choose? I think I was 25 at the time. Like, there are so many other composers who could be here. The music I'm writing is garbage compared to all of this brilliant music by Copland. That all bubbled to the surface. And after that residency, I wrote my first essay about music and about insecurity and about anxiety. That was published on New Music Box, which is a really wonderful resource for not only composers, but just anyone in music wanting to know what's happening, just what issues we're facing in contemporary music making. So fast forward a few years from that, I think that was 2013 or so, that I started writing about anxiety and self-doubt in music. And I found myself really thinking about what resources I lacked as a beginning composer, and then as a composer graduating from grad school, facing a career, sort of vaguely knowing the career that I wanted. I think as most of us do, and maybe, I don't know if any of you would like to speak about this too, but like the thoughts that you have when you're a recent graduate and you think, okay, I could get a teaching position, I could go get even more degrees, I could try and forge a path freelancing. I was just thinking about this huge lack of information there is, I think, for making those choices, and then for dealing with all of the mental angst that comes up when we're thinking about this, and especially when we're looking at our peers and our colleagues who sometimes are doing better than us. I should put better in quotes, right? They're on a different path, and that doesn't look like our path at all sometimes. And just weighing, like, what are we supposed to be doing, and how are we supposed to be feeling about it? I really was thinking, if I could go back in time and give myself just sort of a reassuring, like, it's going to be okay. Here's why it's going to be okay. If you just knew all of this earlier, it would feel a lot more okay. That was sort of the overall attitude behind this book. And that led to me thinking really, that's sort of a vague way of thinking about it, right? But thinking really concretely, what are the exact strategies I use on a daily basis just to get through my day without feeling painful anxiety or jealous comparison to other people, all of that. That's really where the seed for this book came from.
Well, it's so great. I wish I could go back in time, and 10 or 15 years ago, I had read your book, because even reading it now, there's just so much that's helpful. And I agree. I mean, the time around when I was finishing school, or even in transition between degrees, it honestly, it felt like a crisis time. Like, you don't know what's coming up next. You don't know, you're always thinking, how am I doing compared to my peers? And like you said, there's always somebody maybe ahead of where you are, or on a different path that you want to be on, or, you see people honestly deciding to go into different lines of work because maybe it's more viable and that kind of thing. And it can feel unsettling. So it's wonderful that you've put this together, and I highly recommend it to any of our listeners. It's just great.
Yeah, I was just going to follow up with what Karli said. I hope no one minds me sharing, but all three of us co-hosts here finished a DMA, had some sort of job that was not viable career job, I guess you could say, a job in music, but not something that had a career ladder moving forward in that very position. So yeah, it's like very common. Like all three of us dealt with this crisis. Like, you know, I applied to undergrad, got in, went to school, that was cool. Applied to masters, got in. You know, and it's like this. Like I'm applying and getting in, and it's great. Then you finish a DMA, and all right, what now? Where do I sign up for my gig?
Well, staying composed is, Dale, it's so honest about the really tough parts of your own creative work. And that's one of the things that I love about it. In a world where sometimes it seems like we only see like the very best of everybody's life, even personal life and professional life, how did it feel to write this book and admit that composing and your creative process is not always like wonderful and amazing and smooth sailing?
Yeah, I think it could have been something really scary, except that I'd been testing the waters with that bigger, it's a really big conversation, right? To talk about mental health, to talk about not knowing what you're supposed to do, or feeling that imposter syndrome, or any of these things. Like it can feel really overwhelming and scary to bring them up with other people. But I found that if you, again, test the waters in smaller ways, like if you have a colleague who's also a friend, who understands the specific struggles that you're going through that might be unique to your instrument, to being a musician, but where that feels like a safe space where you can be open and honest about your own struggles. So often that's met with the other person saying, oh my gosh, I go through that all the time. Here's how I deal with it. Or even saying, I don't know how to deal with it. How do you deal with it? And then you work together towards a solution, or a practice of maybe not. I think when we talk about all of this, especially mental health issues, there isn't one band-aid that we can slap on a problem. It is a series of practices, just like with music itself, right? We don't play a piece once and get it in excellent performance shape and then expect that we could come back to it 10 years later and just get up and perform it without looking at it again. Like we would have to work back up to that state, even if it's quicker to get back to it because we did know it so well. That's really how these practices feel for me. So again, testing the waters with those conversations, and then with writing smaller articles too about all of these things, and seeing that those actually got a really positive response. It wasn't people saying, how dare you admit that you're feeling anxious about this, or, oh, like you're the only composer to ever have felt like your music was absolute trash. No, it was the exact opposite. It's so often, and the book's been out for 2 years, I think, and people are still, so often I get emails saying, oh, like this is so relevant to my life and where I am right now. And that's really helpful for me to hear. And that makes me feel even freer in sharing those kind of vulnerable subjects in the future.
I do think these are really universal feelings. I don't know. I almost think labeling something as imposter syndrome makes it feel like that's a specific subset of people who feel that. But I don't know. I don't believe that there's anybody out there that's never thought like, oh, is this good enough? Or do I deserve the opportunities that I have? And I'm sure you've gotten a ton of positive feedback about it. I mean, it's like, it's humanizing to understand like someone like you that I would think, oh, she's doing so great. Look at all these accolades. Like she's got a wonderful career that she's built for herself. And then to know that, no, you have good days and more challenging days, just like everybody else. I always think, I think I've mentioned this on the show before, but the classic quote from one of my former teachers and mentors, Keith Aleo, he would always say, every challenge is a gift. And I've come back to that so many times through my life. And the one that I think of is I had like this elbow injury several years ago. And I was at the time like really afraid to even ask certain people, like, what could I do for this? Like, I just felt embarrassed. Like, oh, does it mean I have bad technique? No, it really just means I kind of overdid it in a particular type of practicing. And, and having gone through that and trying to find relief and a healthier practice schedule and all of that helps me with students who need help or colleagues too. So it's the same way that all of these things that you've gone through with things I'm sure when you were at the Copeland residency, you weren't thinking, I'm so grateful for the opportunity to work through these challenging feelings that I'm having, but it's such a gift that now you've shared with so many people.
Yeah, I definitely, I was there thinking, I'm so grateful to be here. Like, what an opportunity. This is amazing. And at the same time, feeling very complex emotions. And I think it is important to acknowledge too that we very often have those two feelings at once, where we are grateful, we are happy to be here, we get a gig that we're really excited about, and then we're still really nervous about it. And those feelings can exist at the same time. That's so normal. It's not a binary. It's not one or the other. It's completely ordinary.
Right. That means you really care when you're eliciting both of those extreme responses, I suppose, anxiety and, self-doubt and that kind of feeling with also excitement and yeah. Well, one of my favorite sections in your book, Dale, is the one that's titled, What Are Your Creative Blocks Telling You? And I thought it was so, I've never read anything before that laid it out like that. I just thought it was so insightful. I think for a long time, I've not been consciously aware of why I would procrastinate or avoid certain tasks or types of work, and I still catch myself doing it sometimes. So I'm wondering, would you tell us about your relationship with procrastination and what advice you have for young musicians to procrastinate better, which is something you talk about in the book?
Yeah, so I think there's really, it's a twofold strategy, and the really big aspect of this is recognizing when you're procrastinating and trying to figure out why, like, what does that procrastination have in common with other times that you're procrastinating? And for me, it's always, I can always trace it back to some resistance towards the piece as a whole, or sometimes it's something way more simple. It's just like, I need to go take a break. I need to let myself do something else and not force myself to go sit down and muscle through composing. Honestly, so much of this book is about not muscling through. And I think that has to do too with what I was saying earlier about being, especially being in the earlier stages of your career. So hopefully the book is for everyone. If you're in the early stages of your career, you can get this messaging that's like, you have to power through, you have to say yes to everything, you have to do it all. And there's some truth in that, but there's also a lot of value in recognizing that if you are procrastinating doing something and it's the same kind of work over and over and over again, maybe you should be saying no to that work. Like, if you actually genuinely do not like what you're doing to the point where you will put it off indefinitely as many times as you can. I know for me, like that, just recognizing that there's certain pieces that I like writing more than others, and turning down commissions, which feels very frightening when you're making a full-time living from composing and from commissions. Like, it feels weird to say no to anything, but really I can trace back, again, like taking a look at the different kinds of procrastination. Like, do I just need to get up and go eat a snack because I'm really like, or take a nap because I'm tired or I'm hungry? Like, that's a very small issue. But if you keep taking on this one kind of work and you're making any excuse at all to avoid doing that work, that might be an underlying bigger issue that is really worth taking a look at. And maybe you want to structure your life so that you don't take on that work, or just approach that work in a different way.
Kind of tagged onto that, I had some years ago, I can't remember how long back, a therapist tell me something real similar about procrastinating when it's like, why are you procrastinating? Because my issue isn't working. It's like, and you get into this in your book about leaning in. I think it's leaning into it, about just starting, like, I'm going to work for 5 minutes. And that's my thing. Once I start, I'm fine. It's like going to the gym. It's like, I got to get dressed. I got to drive there. I got to do all this stuff. Like, it seems like such a big buildup. But they talked about, yeah, why is it so hard to take the first step? And I feel like for me, and probably for some other people, it was like I don't know, maybe an insecurity about like, oh, I'm going to work on my composition stuff. So, I'm starting the new project, and this is like the new baby that's going to be put out into the world here in a couple of months. So every little thing I do now is building to that big moment of judgment from other people. But yeah, I really, really liked your part about leaning into it. About I just pulled up just a sample of yours, but it was talking about, I literally just did this 2 hours ago. I'll just wash 3 dishes right now because I was kind of out of plates. But yeah, it's just, yeah, you wash 3 dishes and then it's like, okay, well, I'm here, I'm going, and then you finish the job. And yeah, I feel like for me, that was always been my biggest struggle, is just starting, or the blank score, things like that.
I'll set up little like traps for myself in a happy way, like what you were saying with the dishes, where I'll make a list of all the easy things I could do in my work. And I talk about that in the book too, but like I write a lot of choral music, but even when it's not choral music, there, like an example with choral music would be putting in the lyrics if I haven't put in the lyrics yet. But with any kind of music, there's always like doing the dynamics. I will put that off forever, but it's so mindless. I can also do that at any point. I can go in and put in all these markings and fuss with formatting and make sure that the page turns make sense. There's all these little tiny details that are so mindless that I can use them as a little trick. Like if I just start working on that, then eventually, usually that turns back into composing, because maybe I'm bored, but I have Sibelius open now and I'm in the file, I'm digging around in the notes, and then I just start composing, and then I'm working, and I've overcome my procrastination that way.
It also reminds me of a few weeks ago when we had Naoko Takata on, and she talked about like behavioral changes, and it's like, okay, so why don't you put your snare drum in front of the refrigerator? So like you have to practice snare drum in order to open the refrigerator. So yeah, I think that it's funny like hearing Caleb talk about the dish thing. There's like a lot of those like minor little behavioral tweak things that can really affect our behavior.
Yeah, a while back, gosh, I can't remember how long ago, but we were talking about a woman who would sleep in her running clothes so it was easier to get up and go running, just like less resistance to doing what you need to do. With, I guess, responding to what Caleb said, Caleb, you mentioned judgment, like thinking about, oh, this next project is going to be, like people are going to make a judgment about it, good or bad or indifferent. And I think that's what gets me a lot, is the big projects that I put off are the ones that I really care about and I really want to be perfect, like maybe proposals or anything that's going to be online, recordings, video, audio, that kind of thing. Dale, does that resonate with you too, of one of the barriers being kind of feeling like it has to be perfect, and then so you put it off? It doesn't do us any good, but we put it off, like just with these feelings of like, well, I don't know if it'll be perfect enough.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the bigger the project, the more intimidating it is. Maybe for all of us, I don't know if that's universal, but that's absolutely true for me too. And it's been really helpful to think about the writer Anne Lamott's concept of shitty first drafts. Hopefully I can say shitty here, shitty
Yeah.
first drafts.
We're good.
But just her concept, and again, Anne Lamott is a writer. She's talking about writing words, but it applies to everything. And I use this all the time, especially with something like a grant proposal, where I know ultimately I'm going to want it to be as perfect as it possibly can be, in hopes of getting tens of thousands of dollars sometimes. And that's really scary. And the idea that your words and your portfolio are directly responsible for you getting or not getting this funding, like that's intimidating. But if I just start with just putting down literally anything on the paper, I know personally I'm a good editor. I enjoy editing much more than I enjoy writing. And that's true even of composing too. I'll do the same thing, where I need to if I can just get some notes down on the paper, then I can come back and make them better the next day. So one thing I talk about in the book too is this idea of what's good and bad when we're thinking about art, when we're talking about any sort of creative act. It's really helpful for me to only ask that question, is this good, in certain parts of my process. And I should not and I cannot ask it at the very beginning stages, because if I am asking whether what I'm writing is any good while I'm also trying to write a shitty first draft, the whole point of the first draft for me is just to get anything down and come back and make it better. So I can't think about good. I can't think about what anyone else is going to think about it. I just have to put my head down and spit out anything, literally anything onto the page, words or notes, knowing that I can definitely go back and refine that later. And that helps so much with the intimidation factor.
There's this quote that I love from Martha Graham, and it's the one that starts, "There is a vitality, a life force, and energy, a quickening that is translated through you into action. And because there is only one of you in all of this time, this expression is unique." She's basically talking about like, don't block the creative ideas and creativity that you have within you. And she says later, "It is your business to keep it yours clearly and directly, to keep the channel open. You do not even have to believe in yourself or your work. It is not your business to determine how good it is, nor how valuable, nor how it compares with other expressions." And I always like that. In fact, I have a copy of this on my office door right now. Well, Dale, Staying Composed was published in 2019, and I'm sure that it was a timely read for many people during the pandemic, as it was for me, especially the chapter that's titled "Stalling Out," with a section titled "When it feels like nothing's happening, use that time wisely." And you write about so many ways that we can further our artistic careers and stay artistically engaged and motivated through slow times. So I'm wondering, is there anything that you think you might have added to the book before publishing if you had happened to write it during or after the pandemic? Maybe in other words, what are some of the lessons that you've learned about the creative process since the pandemic?
Yeah, honestly, I mean, this last going on 2 years now, this last year and a half has been really hard for me, as it has for a lot of or all musicians, I think. And there's a lot already in Staying Composed about moving through things with as much ease and grace as possible, about forgiving yourself when you're not reaching your maximum capability, productivity. Like, that doesn't always have to be the goal. I know for me during the pandemic, a lot of the goal was just get through a day and exercise a little bit, maybe like go for a walk, drink some water, take my vitamins, like just go easy on myself, especially when I think this was obviously this was a really unique case where normally if my work was drying up, I would circle back to all the people that I know, people that I've worked with before, colleagues. That's a really big point in this book, right? Is just, if you just keep seeking out people that you really respect as human beings, and that you also respect as musicians, those are, I think, some of the best collaborators. So usually if I didn't have anything else to do, I'd ask myself, what could I work on with these people? What can I do for myself? Like, I'm a pianist. I could be writing a piece for myself to play. But in the pandemic, it felt like even that was insurmountable some days. I think partially because my mental health, like so many other musicians I know, we were just kind of in a dark place mentally. So on those days when when just doing anything feels insurmountable, to come back to the most basic human needs and to just think of yourself. I've written another essay about this in regards to grief too. And I do think that during the pandemic, it was almost like I was grieving my career, like the loss of certain, like just the loss of my career. It just vanished overnight for a year, basically. But in those times, to treat yourself like an animal, almost. Like, what does this body need? I need water, I need food, I need rest, I need some exercise. Maybe it's really gentle. Like, I just need to be gentle with myself and just take care of myself and make sure that I am healthy and in a functional, good place when we emerge from that. So maybe that's not the best or most helpful. It's certainly like, that feels like a weird answer to put in a book that's about making a living as a musician in a way, right? But I really think that is the truest answer, is just to take care of yourself on the days where you feel like you can't do anything else. Go back to those most basic human functions.
Yeah, I think one thing for probably a whole lot of people, the realization was like we spend so much of our lives, usually well beyond 40 hours a week, on our careers as musicians, and then all of a sudden we didn't have that same urgency or anywhere near the same amount of work, if any, for a while, and so we're forced to think of ourselves as a person, as a human being, not as a musician or a worker or a teacher, all these things that keep us going in the daily grind. And I think that's so important. Pandemic aside, so much of the undertones of your book is maintaining positivity, I think, a positive relationship with the creative process, and not, beating yourself up if you didn't get as much done as you thought might have been possible, or, like trying to avoid some of the negative thoughts and feelings that we have that hold us back.
Yeah, absolutely. And I touch on that in the book too. Like there is a whole chapter on just if, when you get to that point where you're just feeling so anxious or so like, it's okay to take a step back and to tell people that you have to cancel something. Like I canceled, I had a like absurd moment of anxiety in my life in 2019 because I had way overscheduled myself. I was releasing this book and getting married and had like 3 pieces due and was supposed to travel to all these different performances all in the same summer, which is nuts. Like I would not do that now. And I have learned my lesson there. But at the time, I had a moment where I had to acknowledge that I could not possibly do all of these things, and I had to take a step back and I had to put my mental health above my career. And that is scary. That is, if you've never done that before, it's terrifying. But the lesson learned there was that I really do need to schedule in breaks for myself. I need to not just charge ahead and say yes to everything. I need to take time to recharge between each gig, between each life event. Like maybe if you're getting married, don't also try and release a book the month before.
Maybe.
Maybe. Yeah. Lesson for next time.
Yeah, Caleb.
Yeah, I've been thinking about this recently because I took a big break from writing for like the past 6 or 7 months. Just after the pandemic and stuff, I worked through that, but then I just kind of went on pause for a while I moved jobs and states. And yeah, I've been thinking a lot the past like month about like how I would define like if I just met someone at a restaurant or a bar or something, and I didn't describe them that I was or didn't describe myself as a musician first, like what other things would I tell this person? Like, and I've asked a lot of people about it, but it's kind of like, yeah, sometimes in the music world, and I guess well, all the arts, yeah, the art part is kind of your defining personality trait sometimes, which I guess can be good and bad. But it just reminded me when Dale and Karli were talking about, yeah, that just now in the pandemic. But I didn't know if you had any thoughts on that about I don't know. I don't know how to phrase it. It's yeah, managing who you are outside of your defining career goals.
No, I think that's so important. I come back to that question all the time, and that's actually part of what led me to start writing again, is just asking a really basic question of just where do I feel like my creative needs are unmet, and also where are my needs unmet just in my life? Like what more do I want to be doing in my life? And maybe that's a hobby. Maybe, I know for me it meant going back to writing poetry and starting to write short stories, which I think is pretty much a hobby, except I'm so type A that I have trouble doing anything as a hobby. I'm like, how do I submit to 100 literary magazines and see if I can, like, I'm not trying to make a living also as a poet now, but I'm it's just the way my brain works to be like, what else can I do with this now? But it really took asking that question of like, where do I feel like I just could, like I could be doing more beyond my musician identity. I love writing, and I love writing for fun. And maybe that means writing a short story that no one will ever read, but that brings me such joy, and I think does help fill the creative well. It makes me feel creatively fulfilled in the same way that composing a piece for a commission, for a professional ensemble does. Like I feel creatively fulfilled either way, and that's really helpful. Just especially during the pandemic, actually, I ended up writing a lot for fun, just to feed myself creatively in a way beyond that identity that I rely on as like who I am. I am a composer. if you haven't asked yourself that question of like, where do I feel like my creative needs are unmet, or just where, like, what am I not doing? Again, as a human person, what am I not doing that I want to try? Maybe I'll be bad at it. Maybe I want to take archery lessons or something. Like, it could be something really, really obscure and strange, but I think we owe it to ourselves to reach out beyond our core identities as like that we cling to as like, I'm a successful professional musician. You can do that and be so much more. Or maybe you're just a really good friend or a really good parent or a really, you know, like that has equal important value as well.
I was going to say, has anyone here watched the one-man special called In and of Itself? It's
No.
on Hulu, and it's one of the most fascinating things I've ever seen, if not single-handedly the most fascinating thing I've ever seen. But it's sort of like a thought-provoking thing, sort of presented as a magic show. But it's by this guy named Derek Delgado, and he has this interesting thing. He says, we ask kids, what do you want to be when you grow up? But we ask adults, what do you want, or excuse me, what do you do? And he said, what we're really asking is, what have you become? And as part of the show, he has everyone pick a card, and it's like, you select your identity, and you can pick that I am a plumber or a musician, but then there's also things like idiot or mother, like things that are just like, oh, this is what I've become. So anyway, I wasn't really going anywhere with that, but it's on Hulu. Recommend checking out In and of Itself.
Go ahead.
I did see that, and it was great. It was so great. I loved it. You were absolutely right that everyone should watch it.
That's so cool. I haven't seen it, but I thought it was funny that Ben said plumber, musician, and then put idiot and mother in the same next phrase.
Not in any way equivalent.
I won't tell your mom.
Happy belated birthday, Mom. Her birthday was last week.
Well, Dale, in an article titled Don't Expect Congrats that was published in Cantate magazine in the fall of 2019, you write about frequently being asked to compose on the subject of womanhood or to discuss your experiences as a female composer. And judging by your writing, I think that you and I share some similarly complicated feelings on this issue, where I'm always happy to see greater diversity amongst percussionists and composers, but it's always a little annoying to me when somebody says, like, it's so great to see that you're a girl and a percussionist, or, that kind of thing. Like, I just want to, I'd rather you say, hey, I love your playing, you played great, rather than it has to be tied to my gender. But anyway, would you share with us some of your thoughts on this? And I'm wondering if anything has changed since you wrote this 2 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot has changed in the way that the United States, at least as a country, is dealing with identity and gender, and the way that we, there's been a positive trend in recognizing that, at least within, classical music and art as a whole, there's a lot of putting whiteness and maleness on a pedestal, I think, based on who we look at from history, right? And there's an attempt now to reckon with that and to ask better questions about, like, how do we gauge this idea of a masterpiece or a genius, and if we've only ever recognized that in people who happen to be white and male, that's doesn't really pave the path for changing that in the contemporary world. All of which is to say that I think at least when it comes to, like, for me, speaking as a woman who is white, right? That is my identity. I am often asked still to write about women's issues, quote unquote women's things. I think less of that's happening now. I know other composers who are not white are being asked to write pieces about their identity, but not necessarily in a way that they get to choose. And I think this is the issue here. If you ask me to write a piece and I come to you with a text by an author who identifies as female, who wants to write about her experience as a woman, and I want to set that, and I'm a woman, and we write a piece that's about being a woman. Like that's what I want to do. I'm choosing to do it because I want to do it. But if the only opportunities I'm getting are ones that ask me to speak to a very narrow slice of what it means to be a woman, I'm just not into that personally. And again, I know I can't speak on this as someone who is white. I can't speak on what it feels like at all to be not white and asked to do that for your racial identity. But from, again, my understanding is that also feels pretty terrible. Like that doesn't feel great to be asked only to write about your identity in a very narrow little box of like, we want to hear your voice, but only if you talk about this. I'm not into that. So what I would love to see more of personally is composers and anyone in conductors, anyone in any sort of capacity to choose who they're collaborating with and who they're hiring, to make sure they're casting a wide net, to make sure they're looking, if everyone that comes to mind is homogenous, like a homogenous identity, maybe to recognize that and to cast a wider net and just make sure they're considering a wider variety of people. And then if you are commissioning a composer, or maybe if a conductor is or a performer is being asked to program a concert, to let that person have agency in what they're choosing to create. I think, again, I'm speaking from my limited perspective and experience here, but that just feels so much better than someone coming to me and saying, oh, we're doing a concert specifically about, oh, here's an example. Okay, so I've been programmed on a concert about motherhood, despite the fact that I do not have children. And right now I'm not planning to have children just because I'm a woman. They were like, oh, cool, here's a concert about mothers. And I'm like, this is what, why? Just why? I don't get it. Yeah. I think people could be more thoughtful in the way that they approach all of it.
Yeah, I think it's easy for people of underrepresented groups in the arts to start to feel like we're doing a much better job as a whole. I think with giving a voice and a platform to people from underrepresented groups, but the danger is, I think, making people feel like that is their value. Like, oh, your place at the table is because you're a Black percussionist or a woman composer or any other, less represented group in the music world. It's tricky. I have to say, I appreciate so much of the effort that's gone on, even when it's things like, Dale, what you said, like being asked to write about motherhood when you're not a mother and don't necessarily expect to be in the future. I appreciate at least that we're thinking women should write about motherhood and not programming, several male composers to discuss a topic that, maybe would be less appropriate, or even the things programming like entirely, works by women composers for an entire program. Which I think you wrote in this article, like that's not really a theme, right? That's a character, like that's, I guess, one characterization of, something that all these pieces have in common, but it's not a thoughtful presentation on on like a work of art, like a concert program could be.
Yeah, it almost feels like laziness in a way, or to be like, here's a group of South Asian composers. Bloop, like here they are, I rounded them up and I put them on a program for you. And you're like, okay, but what does the music, like when I come to a concert, I want to know what the music, like why did you put these pieces on this program in this particular order? How do the pieces speak to each other? And you can do all of that. You can have a program of pieces that all happen to be written by women, or maybe it's a mix. Maybe there's a few pieces. I don't know. I'm kind of anti the lady composer concert, right? I'm kind of over it. And like I said, but to talk about, if you're going to do that, to do it and then talk about the music, talk about why you love the music, why these two pieces are next to each other on the program, how they speak to each other, what you might hear in common, or the extreme differences in these pieces, and you love them because they provide such a contrast to each other in one specific way. I think if, again, people in a position of programming power, if they could bring us the music with the same attention and care that they do with any other piece by any other composer when they're dealing with underrepresented groups, I just think that would be such an improvement on, again, things like the lady composer concert.
Yeah, well agreed. I appreciate your thoughts on it. Dale, you've written several articles and essays. They're available on your website that relate to career development. Here's just a few of the titles: Composing the Cold Email, 5 Ways to Improve Your Bio, which is great, How to Get Your First Commission, Let's Break the Money Talk Taboo, and many, many more that are just super helpful for especially young professionals, but I think people really at any stage in their career. I'm wondering what you think are some of the most important non-musical skills that young musicians today should be developing, especially these things we don't always talk about in school.
Yeah, I mean, I think, honestly, I wish I had known as a younger composer that I could go to my composition teacher and ask these questions. I think I sat with them in a bubble, and the way that composition lessons in particular are approached, and again, maybe this is something you can all tell me about your experience in lessons, how that was treated. But I think so much of taking lessons in a university setting is you come in and you're trying to make the music the best that it can be. And that's great, that's wonderful. But for the teacher to maybe even just be available to answer an email with one specific question, if you're, say, writing your bio and you have literally no idea as a little 18-year-old how to craft a good bio, I think it would be so helpful. And I know I used to teach piano, not in a university setting, but just to mostly kids. But I tried to make myself available for questions about just anything, like anything that came up that was remotely tangentially related to the piano and to music, and to whether it was something about being anxious about performing, or I just think if we created just a little more space that we could, yes, aim for virtuosity if that is the goal, or just aim for the music to be the best it can possibly be for each individual student. And just make a little space for letting the student feel that they can ask those questions, and that you will, if you are a mentor figure, if you're in that position of power, again, this comes back to that, like if you're in a position of power with programming or with your conducting or your teaching, letting people know they can come to you with questions, period. Like it doesn't have to be this imbalance of power. Yeah, I guess that's kind of a more general approach to that than saying like, you should know that, like one thing in the bio article, I say, don't ever start with like Dale started taking piano lessons when she was 7. Like so many bios say that, and it's so boring. It's so boring. It's like you and thousands, hundreds of thousands of other people, you all started lessons when maybe you were 5, maybe you were 6, maybe you're 7. Like no one cares. But yeah.
I guess I think what I hear from you and so much of your writings and your book and everything is like making information more accessible than maybe it was for previous generations. And I mean, I had amazing teachers through all 3 of my degrees who I'm sure if I sat down and said like, hey, can you read my bio? Can we go over this? Or, you know, any number of these things that we have to do as musicians, I'm sure they would have done it. But I remember feeling maybe there's a little bit of a barrier, or you think they only want to hear you play in your lesson. They don't want to check out your website and tell you all the things that you should change. Or actually, to be honest, Ben, do you remember studio class with Matt Strauss when he made us all have CVs?
Yes, and we all hated it, but he was right.
We all hated it, and then when we were DMAs when we first needed a CV for anything, like there it is. And the hardest thing about that is starting it. But
I know I had to I think I was applying for a grant, maybe in grad school or right out of grad school, and they needed a CV, and I didn't even know what it was. Like I had to Google, I think I Googled composer CV or something, and finally I found a composer who had listed, like there was the PDF was there, and I just copied hers exactly, but it took, like no one had even mentioned the words CV to me before. I knew what a resume was, but I didn't know this extensive list, and then it's a little different for composers. And yeah, if I'd even known that there was someone I could ask about that, I think that would have been a great help.
My favorite CV story is that when I first had to make one, I asked my former teacher, William Mursh, hey, can I see your CV, just for formatting, and he sent it to me. And his CV I think it was like 50 pages long, because he's had a career since the 70s. And I learned from that he played on Saturday Night Live. But I mean, it was like so far beyond. Obviously, he's much further in his career than I am, or than I was at the time, especially. That yeah, it's challenging with something like a CV to have a generic answer of what should be on your CV, because if you are a recent high school graduate, you probably don't have a CV, but if you did, what would a high school graduate CV look like versus someone like, say, Karli, that has a career in this and has all of her degrees done and probably isn't listing that she played in all-region band in 11th grade on her CV. Or maybe she is. I don't know.
That's what you think. Yeah, I remember his CV being like I heard rumors about it, I think, from grad students when I was an undergrad, and like, oh, it's this scary thing where you have to list everything you've ever done. And that already feels, when you're 20, that feels like overwhelming. And then later you get to a point you have to make it. And yeah, if it hadn't been for Matt Strauss making us put it together, probably first year of our DMA, I don't know, I would have been in a panic later having to do it. Dale, I wanted to ask you, what are your current projects and what's coming up for you that you're looking forward to?
Yeah, so I have a bunch of choral pieces, which, as I said before, is the norm for me. It's probably like 80% choral music, 20% non-choral music. I just finished a 25 minute piece for voice and guitar that I'm really excited about, because I love the challenge of writing for instruments that I'm not quite as familiar with. I've written for guitar once, I think, before this, for the same guitarist, and to have the chance to expand on that in a bigger piece is really exciting. And yeah, there are a few pieces. It's funny, the pandemic has sort of not only shifted everything, but also made dreaming about bigger projects possible for me in a lovely way. And that's one way that I did take advantage of the downtime of the pandemic, where I tried to go back to, again, those questions of like, what am I in control over, and who do I really want to work with in the future? And so one thing I'm really excited about is somewhere between 20 and 30-minute long ballet with a ballet company in Modesto, California. And I'll be playing the piano part as well, which I'm a little intimidated about, because I'm much more of a composer than I am a performer. Though in college I used to accompany all the time, like Karli said at the start of the episode. But I'll be recording that on an album as well. And so just getting excited about there are other album projects in the works with people that I've loved collaborating with in the past. And I think that's always the best question to come back to, again, when you're feeling uncertain about what your next creative steps are. Who do I already know that I love working with, and how could I possibly collaborate with them again?
Well, I look forward to hearing about those things. I'm wondering, if you're writing a part for yourself to play, do you find it's difficult? I always think, if I'm writing something, like, I don't want, there's resistance. I don't want to do something that's super hard, because that'll be annoying for me later. Do you run into those feelings?
Yeah, I have a choral conductor friend who, I guess his mentor used to always say all the time, the juice has to be worth the squeeze. And so now I think that to myself, just about composing in general, but especially if I have to play the piece myself, I'm thinking I'm gonna have to practice a lot more to get this, however many measures of tricky music there are. And I'll definitely think, like, can I put them again? Like, if I'm gonna practice that hard? Can I make that happen again later in the piece? Like, how do I make it worth myself learning all of that? And or make it fun too. Like, it's hard, but I'm going to enjoy the challenge of having to practice this over and over and over again.
Right. Yeah.
I had a question about your "Let's Talk About Money" article, more or less. I find that's a really hard one. Not so much when you get to maybe the four of us's level, our levels, but the hardest one for me is undergrads. And it's not just composition, but I feel like there's this, I can't figure out which side of the fence I'm on, where it's, all right, they need either that drumline judging teching gig / they need that commission for free, but I also want them to be, they don't need to be working for free at the same time. So do you have any thoughts on that, between balancing young students between, where is the line between doing it for free for exposure, which is always rough, versus, charging a fee?
Yeah, I was lucky in that I reached out with a bunch of these very practical questions to another composer that I really liked her music, Abby Patinas. And I was a junior in college at the time. And I asked her these questions, and she sent back this really thoughtful email. It was really long and it was so helpful. And I try to do that now whenever anyone sends me that same sort of question. But one of her answers that really stuck with me was, always make sure that you're getting something in return, even if it's not monetary. So make sure that you're getting a really good recording that you can use on your website to promote yourself and that work. This maybe applies more for composers, but just make sure that it feels like an exchange of something, even if there's no money attached. And then something that I tell composers who are really unsure about commissioning fees, because this is especially true for undergrads, when someone says, like, what do you charge? And maybe you've been writing a lot of pieces for friends for free, and then they perform the piece on their recital and you get a really good recording, and like that feels like a nice exchange. But I say you can start by asking for a certain amount, like maybe outside of that setting, like maybe you've graduated and now you need, like you do want and need to be making money. You can always start with something that feels comfortable to you. Maybe it's like $50 or $100. And then every time someone asks you again, you raise it. So maybe next time you say $250. And this, I mean, maybe you start at $250, maybe next time you say $500. Next time you make sure that for me, the sweet spot, even now, is just feeling a tiny bit uncomfortable in a way where I feel like I'm getting away with something if the person says yes to that amount, but I don't feel so wildly uncomfortable that I'm saying, this 5-minute choral piece is going to cost $20,000. Like, maybe someday I'll get there, but right now, if I were to say that, I would be like, that's not, like, I couldn't even say it out loud, because that just feels astronomical still to me, even though I charge a lot of money for my commissions. But yeah, I feel like even starting with undergrad, saying, like, what would make you feel like you were almost like you were getting away with something if someone said yes to this number. And also, you don't want to be so wildly uncomfortable throwing out a number that you can't even say it with a straight face. Like, it just makes you feel inside. Those two, that balance for me, like, that's just carried me through my entire life of quoting rates.
I think that's really smart. I would say as performers, we don't have to set our rates as often. And every time that I do, it still makes me a little uncomfortable, because you have to think about, who's hiring you. Is it a really big performing arts organization, or is it a well-established group, or is it, your friend's friend from somewhere else, like a friend of a friend who is putting something together on a shoestring budget, and they're really trying to get something great off to a good start. So it's tricky, but I laughed, Dale, when you said charge a number that you just feel a little bit uncomfortable with, because that's the number, I've been there, and that's the number that will probably make you feel like I'm getting paid, like I'm real pleased with what I'm getting paid here.
I was going to add one other thing. If you just think about the total cost of things, chances are, like, unless you're very well established, like, your flight somewhere is going to be more expensive than your artist fee. Like, if you're getting a $400 flight, you can probably ask for more than $100. Like, I think if you're traveling like that, that's a reasonable thing to ask. Obviously, if you're doing something local, especially if you're a less experienced person, it's that's more difficult. But for me, that's been one thing recently. Like, I start thinking about, like, well, the flight costs this much and the hotel cost, like, by the time it's all said and done, I'm only making like 10% of what they're actually paying. So
I always, for commissions, I always put flight and hotel separate. They are completely separate now in every contract from the commissioning fee. But I know gigs are different. Performance gigs are different from that. Maybe
It certainly can be. Yeah. Yeah. It's not. Yeah, it totally depends. There's such a wide range, but more often we're told there's this much money to play, either a recital or a chamber concert, or more often an orchestral gig. This is what it is per service, and then you decide, yep, sounds great, or no, I can't do it, or it's not quite enough to make it worthwhile.
I'll say one more thing about that too, about the issue of just how much to charge and when and where are you in your career. One thing that's been working for me during the pandemic is thinking of things on a sliding scale. Especially, I've been using this for Zoom rehearsals, but sometimes I use it for commissions as well. Where if a community chorus is coming to me and they want a Zoom rehearsal of a piece of mine, and their budget is $50 feels a little low to me now, but if I really wanted to work with them, maybe I've worked with them before, I know they've done so much of my music, I might say yes to that. But if it's a professional group coming to me, I might charge $250. Like I say now, when people come to me, I will ask how, like, I'll say, this is my fee, but I'm willing to work on a sliding scale if that's what works for you. And I don't say that as much with commissions, but I will say that if someone, like, I recently wrote a piece for just an individual commissioning a piece for her daughter, and I quoted a very different rate than I would for an organization or a college coming. Like, I have my set rate, but then I also give myself permission. If I really, really want to do the piece and the person doesn't have the budget, I don't want to beat myself up about, like, I have to be making a certain amount. I'm giving myself the grace to say yes to just an ordinary person making an ordinary salary, not a big university that can pay thousands and thousands of dollars.
Right, absolutely. That's very smart. And you have to make sure that you feel good with the work that you're doing and with what you're getting in return. I guess that's the bottom line. All right. Well, Dale, thank you so much for joining us. It's so wonderful to hear, first to see you and speak with you, and also to hear about all the work that you've been doing. Congratulations on so many successes.
Thanks so much again. Yeah, this has been really fun for me too. So thanks so much again for having me.
Yeah, thank you.